Hey friends, this is Nate Nims from Grace Des Moines. Thank you for being with me today on this Spiritual Practice Thursday. We look at different spiritual practices, the ways that we can enhance and live out our faith. But today we're going to do things a little bit differently and not talk about a spiritual practice that we should try, but instead one that we need to avoid. And the one that we need to avoid is what has been called spiritual bypassing. Now, spiritual bypassing is a term that was coined by the psychotherapist and psychologist John Welwood. In the 1980s, they came up with this term to talk about the ways that spirituality and faith are used to avoid our feelings and to get around issues instead of dealing with them directly. So in their book in the 1980s, John Welwood defined spiritual bypassing like this: using spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep personal, emotional, unfinished business, to shore up a shaky sense of self, or belittle basic needs, feelings, and developmental tasks. We see spiritual bypassing in our lives or in our communities when someone says something like, God won't give you more than you can handle. Or maybe we've heard it said, when God closes a door, God opens a window. Or maybe you've heard it said, God just needed another angel. Or in the context of our current reality around racism and Black Lives Matter, maybe you've heard people say, God created all lives equal. And that spiritualization, the realization that God created us all equal, bypasses the reality that in the lives we've created with one another, we aren't equal. Sometimes spiritual bypassing is used in a way where folks feel like they cannot express their anger. And so instead of saying things out loud, instead of admitting to their feelings, they hold them in and only release them in prayer, but never have the conversations with the individuals that they need to. Spiritual bypassing is often seen through avoidance of anger, devaluing your feelings, being emotional numb, or just sort of pushing down and repressing your feelings, and then judging others when their feelings, their emotions flare up. You can think about spiritual bypassing a bit like this. It highly favors our intellect, but does not favor emotional intelligence. And so it's this cognitive space where we think our way through and we intellectualize around using the traditions and the practices of our faith instead of going through that difficult space. And as psychologists and therapists and folks like Carl Jung would say, if we avoid it, we still carry it with us. What we resist just sort of grows in our shadow self, as he might say. So spiritual bypassing, it is something that we all do from time to time. And it's something that we have to catch ourselves in. And so a way that we can avoid this spiritual practice that we often find ourselves in, or that we can find one another's in, a way to get around it is a practice called SNAP. SNAP stands for stop, notice, ask, and pivot. So the first step is stop, which means literally stop, slow down, ask yourself, what am I doing? Right? That's the notice. You stop, you catch yourself in the moment, and then you notice, what are you thinking? What are you doing? What made you process that way? And then you ask yourself, could there be another way to do this? Often with spiritual bypassing, we can ask ourselves, am I doing this practice to avoid feelings? Am I saying this to feel better in this moment, even though it might be negative in another way? And then we pivot. We ask ourselves, am I using my spirituality to avoid negative feelings to avoid confrontation, to avoid difficult conversations. And what could it look like if I just pivoted and had that conversation? I don't know your experience with conversations that you've wanted to have but couldn't quite bring yourself to do. At least for myself, the script that I can go through in my own head of thinking how terrible it's going to be is often a lot worse in my mind than it is in reality in the moment that we have with one another. That's what can make the practice of spiritual bypassing so dangerous in our relationships and in our lives together, because it sets up this trap where instead of connecting with one another as our faith should do, we continue to separate and go different directions instead of finding a way forward with grace and peace. So, I hope you, like me, can devote yourself to spiritual bypassing. And I know I'm going to have a difficult conversation with my cats because they're shaking my camera right now. And if I just avoided that by saying, well, they're created in God's image to do God's goodness and grace, I believe that. But that doesn't mean that they can be disruptive and get in the way, right? It's the same thing for us. Don't bypass, don't avoid, go through. And as you go through, remember that God is with you. So thank you for being with me today. And snap was that other practice, that other thought. And it's stopping when you catch yourself, noticing what you were doing and what got you to that time, asking yourself if this is really the only way to do it, if things would be worse or better if you did them another way, and then pivoting, that small turn that you could take to try things another way. So thank you for joining me.